Hello everyone, welcome back to the Doctrine, Dogma, and Davide podcast. My name is Davide, and today I want to talk a little bit about the question of whether or not the Pope can be deposed by the Church. Now, this is going to be another very long, research-heavy video with a lot of sources, so I hope you guys are ready for that. But before I start to get into the real meat of the argument and start looking at some of the sources, I do want to clarify just what it is that I'm going to be responding to and what it is that I'm actually talking about. So when it comes to the idea that the Pope can be deposed, there are two main perspectives that are put forward. The first is that the Pope, if he were to become a material heretic, that the Church could then pronounce a judgment upon the Pope for that heresy, thus deposing him of the pontificate. The other perspective is that if the Pope were to become a material heretic, he would, by that fact alone, inherently lose the pontificate, and the Church would not actually be making any declaration or juridical judgment against the Pope in declaring the see vacant and electing a new Pope. In this video, I'm going to be specifically responding to the position of people like Dr. Taylor Marshall and some others who assert that the Pope can be judged and deposed by the Church, by the ecclesiastical authorities within the Church, in the case of heresy. Now, some of you listening right now might think that it's absolutely absurd to think that the Pope could be deposed for any reason at all. And the case is not as absurd as you might think. And there are others who maybe have already heard Dr. Taylor Marshall talk about this and say, well, of course the Pope can be deposed. I mean, that's what St. Robert Bellarmine said, right? Well, not exactly. Let's actually dive into some of these sources. So, there are three main sources that people will cite in favor of the view that the Pope could be judged in the case of heresy and thereby deposed from the pontificate. The first and most common source that they will cite is St. Robert Bellarmine. They will cite the section of St. Robert Bellarmine's book where he says, quote, "Now the fifth true opinion is that a pope who is a manifest heretic ceases in himself to be pope and head, just as he ceases in himself to be a Christian and a member of the body of the Church, whereby he can be judged and punished by the Church." And he goes through and makes a series of arguments for why this position is very probable. The problem is that this is not what St. Robert Bellarmine actually believed. St. Robert Bellarmine actually believed that the Pope could never become a heretic in the first place, and therefore would not be subject to deposition. St. Robert Bellarmine is discussing 5 possible opinions surrounding whether or not and under what conditions the Pope could be deposed. And because he starts out by saying the fifth true opinion and argues for it in many different ways, people falsely assume that this is what St. Robert Bellarmine believes, that this is the position that Robert Bellarmine himself holds and teaches. But that's not actually the case. The first opinion that he goes through and that he himself favors is actually that the Pope cannot become a heretic in the first place and therefore would not be subject to deposition anyway. He says, quote, "The first is of Albert Pigius, sorry if I mispronounced that, who contends that the Pope cannot be a heretic and hence would not be deposed in any case. Such an opinion is probable and can easily be defended, as we will show in its proper place. Still, since it is not certain, and the common opinion is to the contrary, it will be worthwhile to see what response should be if the Pope could be a heretic." He then goes on to explore 4 hypothetical scenarios of what might happen or what might the response be if the Pope could be a heretic. But St. Robert Bellarmine didn't believe that the Pope could be a heretic in the first place. And so people will, I think, somewhat either ignorantly or disingenuously wave Robert Bellarmine around and try to lean on the authority of, well, this is a doctor of the Church. This is what Robert Bellarmine says. It must be true. When St. Robert Bellarmine actually believed that the Pope could not be a heretic and therefore could not be subject to deposition in the first place. And so people who argue based on Robert Bellarmine's authority would have to first say Robert Bellarmine's position, what he actually believed, is wrong, and then instead say, we therefore have to accept his secondary position, his second favorite position. And I don't think that you can lean on Robert Bellarmine's authority as a doctor of the Church whilst dismissing his actual position. Now, at the same time, St. Robert Bellarmine himself did not express certainty on this point. He himself acknowledged that, this isn't a certain thing, and common opinion is in a different place from where he is. And so he entertains a variety of different ideas on this subject. And so I don't think that we can lean on St. Robert Bellarmine's authority to say that, like, oh, the Pope can't be a heretic because St. Robert Bellarmine says he can't be a heretic. We have to dig a little bit deeper on this. Now, there are two other sources that people will cite. The first is from Pope Innocent III, where during a homily he stated, quote, "For me, the faith is so necessary that whereas for other sins my only judge is God, for the slightest sin committed in the matter of the faith, I could be judged by the Church." And so here you have Pope Innocent III expressly stating that while the Pope cannot be judged on any other matter, he could be judged by the Church in the case of heresy. And this is also supported by a source from canon law. The Digest of Canon Law from Grecian in about the year 1150, it contains under the chapter Si Papa concerning the Holy See, it states, quote, "Whose sins no mortal man presumes to rebuke, for he shall judge all and is to be judged by no one, unless he is caught suddenly deviating from the faith." And so Grecian's work, his Digest of Canon Law, seems to at least imply the possibility that in the case of heresy, the Pope could be judged by the Church. So here you have St. Robert Bellarmine entertaining it as a possibility. You have Pope Innocent III stating the Pope can be judged by the Church. And you have an early source from canon law, not so much stating, but more so implying that the Pope could hypothetically be judged if he is caught suddenly deviating from the faith. Now, before I get into my response on why I'm 95% sure that the Pope can't actually be deposed by the Church, that the Pope can't actually be judged, I do want to state that, like, these are not weak arguments. These are reasonable arguments, and I think that reasonable people can disagree on this subject. I don't think that the Church's teaching is particularly definitive or clear on this issue. But there are several problems that I have with relying on this as some sort of definitive evidence for the case for deposition of the Pope. And I also have several sources that I found, especially the dogmatic definition on papal primacy, that I think poke some serious holes into the idea that the Pope could be deposed for any reason whatsoever. Now, the next document I want to bring up is an encyclical from Pope Pius XII. His encyclical Mediator Dei, paragraph 63, states, quote, "Clearly, no sincere Catholic can refuse to accept the formulation of Christian doctrine more recently elaborated and proclaimed as dogmas by the Church, under the inspiration and guidance of the Holy Spirit with abundant fruit for souls, because it pleases him to hearken back to the old formulas. No more can any Catholic in his right senses repudiate existing legislation of the Church to revert to prescriptions based on the earliest sources of canon law." Now, the reason that I think that this poses a serious problem for the documents in favor of papal deposition is because he articulates two principles that we have to keep in mind. The first is that we cannot use antiquated canon law as evidence for our positions. We cannot take an outdated code of canon law, a code of canon law that is no longer enforced in the Church, and then use it as though it still has some sort of juridical authority. It doesn't. And the second thing we have to keep in mind is that a dogma that is clarified by the Church supersedes anything that came before. And so even if you can find certain doctrines in the Church Fathers, if those theological positions were later condemned by councils of the Church or by a dogmatic definition, then you cannot cite a Church Father to say that this is somehow the teaching of the Church, such as is the case with Origen, who believed in a sort of universalism that in the end everyone would be saved. The Church has condemned that view. And so what Pius XII is saying here is that a more recent clarification of the Church's teaching takes precedence over earlier discussions of that teaching. Which then brings us to the First Vatican Council, where papal infallibility, but also papal primacy of jurisdiction, was dogmatically defined by the Church. In Pastor Aeternus, it states, quote, "Since the Roman pontiff, by the divine right of the apostolic primacy, governs the whole Church, we likewise teach and declare that he is the supreme judge of all the faithful, and that in all cases which fall under ecclesiastical jurisdiction, recourse may be had to his judgment. The sentence of the Apostolic See other than which there is no higher authority, is not subject to revision by anyone, nor may anyone lawfully pass judgment thereupon. And so they stray from the genuine path of truth, who maintain that it is lawful to appeal from the judgments of the Roman pontiffs to an ecumenical council, as if this were an authority superior to the Roman pontiff. And so what this is saying is that any case that falls under the jurisdiction of the church, under the ecclesiastical jurisdiction, a recourse may be had to the judgment of the Bishop of Rome. Now, the case of heresy, who is and is not a heretic, and what is and is not heresy, is certainly a judgment that falls under ecclesiastical jurisdiction. If the church does not have the right to judge heresy and judge heretics, then quite frankly, I don't know what else the church would have the authority to judge. And so Vatican I states that if there's a matter, the judgment of which belongs to the church, to the ecclesial hierarchy, then recourse may always be had to the Bishop of Rome. And so if the Pope were to be accused of heresy by the church, all it would take would be for the Pope to deny the charge, declare himself innocent, and then no one can appeal from the judgment of the Holy See. No one can overturn his judgment of whether or not he is a heretic. And so the dogmatic definition from Vatican I, defining the extent of the Pope's primacy of judgment over the church, would seem to me to make it completely impossible for the church to judge the Pope in any meaningful way, because the Pope will always have the primacy of jurisdiction and the primacy of judgment, and his is always the final word. And so I suppose hypothetically, if the Pope were to agree that he is in fact a heretic, then maybe in that way he'd sort of be judged to the church, but in a greater sense, he's really being judged by himself if he acquiesces to that judgment. And there have been times when the Pope has acquiesced to certain depositions, which actually brings me to some historical evidence that some people like to bring up, but that I really want to go through. Because there are several popes who have been condemned or put on trial or seemingly have been judged by the church. And some of these examples are interesting just to inform the discussion, and others are used as sort of like evidence or even supposedly proof that the Pope has been judged in the past and therefore can be judged. And so I want to go through a few of those cases. Now, when going through these sort of historical events within the church, it's important to understand a concept within the church called the sanction of time. That basically, there are controversies and fights that break out concerning theology and church law throughout the church's history. People fight and argue about these things. So, to put it simply, what the judgment of time is, in a very basic sense, is that when a controversy erupts, let's say a pope or a bishop or some ecclesiastical authority does something that is controversial in the church. He is condemned or defended by various members of the hierarchy. Essentially, once the dust settles in the following centuries, when the church looks back on the events, how does the church understand it in retrospect? Basically, do the actions of those particular prelates receive the sanction of time of the church? That basically the church in its mature judgment have recognized, yes, they did have the authority to do that. No, they did not have the authority to do that. And so, for instance, a council that tries to depose a pope, there's going to be a controversy over whether or not the pope is deposed in the moment. But the question is, does the church, over the course of the next several centuries, recognize that person as a pope, or do they recognize him as having been deposed? So let's start out with Pope Honorius. He's probably the most famous case of a pope being condemned by the church, because Pope Honorius, in 2 private letters, affirmed the Nestorian heresy. And he was actually condemned and anathematized at the 4th Council of Constantinople under Pope Hadrian II. Now, some people might say that Pope Honorius was literally condemned and anathematized at an ecumenical council under the headship of a valid pope. Therefore, the pope can be judged. Here's the problem with this, though. A former pope could certainly be judged by the present pope, but that's not the same thing as judging a living pope. And just because the council declared that Pope Honorius was a heretic, and whether or not he was actually a heretic, or whether he was actually expressing heretical ideas in those two private letters, is still a matter of dispute. But even if the council decided that Pope Honorius was a heretic, he is still recognized as a valid pope by the church. He is not an anti-pope. And so because the church continued to recognize his pontificate as valid, this to me does not imply that the church could depose a pope even if he were determined to be a heretic. Another interesting case is the case of Pope Formosus. So you may or may not have heard of Pope Formosus. He was the centerpiece of the so-called cadaver trial. Basically, his successor, Pope Stephen VI, dug him out of his grave, propped him up, and had a trial. He put him on trial, and then declared him guilty, cut off 3 of his fingers, threw him in an unmarked grave, pulled him out of the grave, and then threw his body in the Tiber. Now, people will point to this incident and point out the fact that a pope was put on trial and convicted by the church. Here, once again, though, is the problem of the fact that it's not actually the judgment of an actual living, reigning pope. The pope, in this case, was not Formosus. It was Pope Stephen VI. And I think it's also really important to understand how Stephen VI responded to Pope Formosus's pontificate, as well as what Pope Stephen VI actually accused Formosus of, because he never actually accused Pope Formosus of heresy. He convicted him of violating Canon 15 of the Council of Nicaea, which was a matter of discipline, not doctrine. The 15th canon of the Council of Nicaea declared, quote, "On account of the great disturbance and discords that occur, it is decreed that the custom prevailing in certain places, contrary to the canon, must be wholly done away, so that neither bishop, presbyter, nor deacon shall pass from city to city. And if anyone, after this decree of the Holy and Great Synod, shall attempt any such thing or continue in any such course, his proceedings shall be utterly void, and he shall be restored to the church for which he was ordained bishop or presbyter." Now, Pope Formosus was pulling bishops out of their dioceses and installing them in new dioceses, which did violate Canon 15 of the church. Here's the problem, though. The Pope actually does have the authority to pull bishops out of their dioceses and put them elsewhere. This is where sort of the sanction of time comes into play. How does the church, in its mature judgment, look at this case? And the church actually judges that Formosus was actually in the right here, that the Pope does actually have the authority to move bishops around. And furthermore, if you want things to get a little bit more complicated, if you think things are confusing now, Pope Stephen VI didn't stop at just convicting and throwing Formosus's body in the Tiber. He actually declared all of his ordinations null and required anyone ordained by Formosus to be reordained. Now, this we know is not necessary. A bishop that is ordained with valid form and matter has a valid apostolic succession. This, once again, is affirmed by the sanction of time granted by the church. We now understand that even schismatic or heretical groups do in fact retain their apostolic succession and their valid orders, even if they are heretics, even if they're excommunicated. As long as you have valid form or matter, the ordinations are still valid. And so Stephen VI was wrong in believing that the priests or bishops would have to have been reordained. But to make it a little bit more complicated, after Stephen VI died, Stephen VI died, I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce it, but the annulments that he made were then themselves annulled by John the Ninth. And then when John the Ninth died, his annulments of the annulments were themselves annulled by Sergius III. And so, if you think it's confusing to be a member of the church now, imagine you're in this situation and each pope is going back and forth about whether or not the ordinations by Formosus were even valid, because the popes were flip-flopping back and forth. And so that's, once again, is why the idea of the sanction of time is so important for understanding these things, is because we now know that Formosus's ordinations, they were valid, and they did not need to be reordained, and they couldn't actually be nullified by the succeeding pope. Additionally, we also know that Formosus was actually perfectly within his rights to violate Canon 15 of the Council of Nicaea, because it does not concern divine law, it concerns canon law, and the pope ultimately is the master of canon law, and may adjust it according to his preferences. And then you have the pontificate of Pope Benedict IX. He was driven out of Rome by a rebellion, and then anti-pope Sylvester III was appointed by his ousters. Benedict managed to retake the city, and then he resigned the papacy so that he could marry his girlfriend, after then being bribed by his successor Gregory VI. He later regretted his decision and attempted to retake the papacy by force, and he succeeded in seizing the apostolic palace on 2 separate occasions, but once he had resigned, he was no longer the valid pope. Some people have said that, oh, he was pope 3 times, because, he claimed to have regained the papacy, but while there's still a living pope, you can't oust someone from the papacy that way. So Pope Benedict IX was really only pope once, and then he continued to claim the pontificate after he had already resigned. Now, his successor, Pope Gregory VI, he ended up appearing before the Council of Sutri, which, by the way, is just a regional council. It's not an ecumenical council. But the council accused him of simony for buying the papacy. Now, he admitted to buying the papacy, but he claimed that it didn't constitute simony. Now, the council assured him that, it is simony to buy the papacy, which, yeah, it is. And they called on him to resign. And the important thing here is that Gregory VI actually did acquiesce. Now, some people have said that Gregory VI was actually deposed. The council deposed him. But I don't think that that's really the case, because Gregory VI, he agreed to the deposition. He didn't resist it. He didn't say, no, I'm still the pope, you can't depose me. He said, all right, I'll step aside and I'll let somebody else take the papacy. That, to me, is a resignation. That is an acquiescence by the Holy See. And once again, that, to me, still accords with Vatican I's definition, that the Pope is the highest authority of the Church. And so if the Pope agrees to be deposed, essentially, that, to me, is no different from a resignation. So even in the case of somebody like Gregory VI, I think that it actually more so indicates that the Pope can't be deposed than that he can. Now, the last historical event that I think we really need to talk about is the Council of Constance. Now, I've talked about the Council of Constance in my video about sedevacantism and why it's not a tenable position. But the Council of Constance was convened to resolve the Great Western Schism. There were 3 claimants to the papacy, one in Avignon, one in Pisa, and one in Rome. The valid pope was Pope Gregory in Rome. Now, the Council of Constance was originally convened by anti-pope John XXIII from Pisa. And here's where it gets really interesting. The council immediately deposed the anti-pope in Pisa and the anti-pope in Avignon. The council then promulgated a heretical document that declared that councils were superior to the pope and do have the authority to depose the pope. Now, we know that this document is thoroughly heretical, and there's some dispute over whether or not the council actually tried to promulgate it, but it directly contradicts the First Vatican Council, and so we know that it is heretical. But the council was convened under the authority of anti-pope John XXIII from Pisa, not the valid pope. And so the council's proceedings weren't actually valid. So this document that they promulgated, declaring themselves superior to the pope and declaring that a council could depose the pope if they wanted to, it wasn't actually a valid ecumenical document. But what it does show is that the people assembled at the council believed that they had the authority to depose the pope. And they went about deposing the 2 anti-popes, declaring the anti-popes to be illegitimate popes. But when it came to Pope Gregory, the valid pope in Rome, they believed that they could depose him, and yet decided not to. They instead asked him to resign. Pope Gregory then agreed to resign on the condition that the council henceforth be convened under his authority, thus making the council valid, and that it is by his authority that the next pope would be elected, who was then Martin V. Now, this to me is an absolutely incredible moment in history, because we know that the council believed that they had the authority to depose the pope, and yet decided not to. And so in every historical case that I looked at, where the pope was supposedly deposed or judged by the church, I found that to not really be the case. The popes being judged or condemned were either dead and therefore no longer the pope, or they themselves agreed to step down, thus making it a resignation and not a deposition. And the sanction of time bears out who was and was not a valid pope. And all of the popes that I've discussed were indeed valid popes. And so what does this all mean? I just talked about a lot of different sources. It's a very confusing topic, and once again, it's not 100% clear. But based on the teachings of the First Vatican Council, the affirmations by Pius XII, as well as all of the historical events given the sanction of time, I feel pretty confident, not 100% confident, I feel pretty confident in saying that the Pope cannot be deposed for any reason. That the Pope is just the Pope, and no matter what happens, unless he resigns or dies, he remains the Pope, and the Church has no authority to depose him. I'm 95% sure that that's the case. But if you think that there's an important source or argument that I missed, that I overlooked, feel free to let me know in the comments. If you liked the video, I hope it was spiritually fruitful for you. If it was, be sure to like, comment, do whatever it is that people of the internet do, and I will see you all next week. God bless you.